Welcome. My name is Summer Ali, and I'm the research professor of law and political science at Vanderbilt University and also co-chair of the Project on Unity and American Democracy. I'm joined today by fellow faculty members to talk about communal trauma in the face of reoccurring gun violence in America today, including mass shootings. We sit down the street right now from where a mass shooting took place just a few months ago at the Covenant School in Green Hills. One of the things we want to talk about today is how do we have these conversations and how do we engage in the societal aftermath effects and impact that we experience as members of communities that are continuously impacted by gun violence, including mass shootings. So today, to speak about this with me, are three of my esteemed colleagues. I'm joined here by my good friend, Dr. Jonathan Metzl, who has written extensively for medical, psychiatric, and popular publications about some of the most urgent, hot-button issues facing America and the world, including gun violence. And I am confident that he will be able to bring that expertise into this conversation today. And to my left is Dr. Nicole Cobb, who is a former school counselor and is still very involved in the area. She led listening sessions in the aftermath of the horrific events here in Nashville at the Covenant School shooting and helps communities throughout the country triage traumatic events. Thank you for being with us here today. And to the left of Dr. Metzl is Dr. Jara Gonzalez Justiniano, whose most recent work wrestles with answering the question of what does hope look like? What does hope look like in this current authorizing environment for violence? Her interdisciplinary approach finds practices that enable a hope that can sustain collective and generational trauma. And that's going to be one of the main points that we talk about today is what do we mean when we talk about collective trauma? What do we mean when we talk about generational trauma? How does it affect us? How does it affect us in real time? And what are some of the tools that we can use in order to deal with this in ways that hopefully help us break out of these cycles of trauma and place us on a pathway that's more promising and that is more peaceful? So Dr. Metzl, let us start with you. Our first question is, can trauma perpetuate shared resentments rather than unifying values?
Well, first, it's great to be having this conversation, and hopefully we're going to all talk among ourselves because we have such interesting perspectives on this. I'll say that for me, I answer these questions about guns and gun violence from kind of two intersecting perspectives. I'm somebody who trained in psychiatry and medicine, and then in kind of sociology and social science. So I study guns and gun violence and trauma from a mental health perspective, but also from a sociological perspective. And I just want to back up a little bit and just start with the question of trauma. And I'll say that two things are important for me. I think it's just a jumping off point for this conversation. And one is just what do we mean by trauma when it comes to guns or mass shootings? Now, you mentioned that we had a mass shooting right down the street from where we are now, the Covenant School mass shooting, which just honestly hit very close to home for a lot of people. We were on campus, we heard the helicopters and the ambulances, and we knew people there. People who work here rushed out to see if their kids were okay, so it felt very close to home. But we also live in an area where gun violence is really an everyday reality. I mean, there are zip codes in South and East Nashville that have some of the highest just daily patterns of gun violence in the country. And we've had other horrible mass shootings like the Waffle House mass shooting here in 2018. Right. And so part of the reason I think that's important is because when I think about trauma from a mental health perspective, I think, of course, of this question of post-traumatic stress disorder. What happens when you suffer a traumatic event and then you have an after effect? And I always come back to the initial studies of PTSD, which were done in active Vietnam pilots. And basically the idea was the number of hours you thought you were going to die correlated with your chance of having some kind of symptom afterwards. And so they would have these pilots who would fly these really dangerous missions above anti-aircraft. And if they flew 10 hours of sorties, they had a 10% chance of developing post-traumatic stress. If they went 50 hours of sorties, so it was like the time that you were in, you thought you were going to die, but then they would fly back to the base and that would be safe. And I think it's so important because in America, it's 24/7, right? Wow. It actually is off the chart, right? People think they're going to die the minute they leave their house, or sometimes a bullet coming through their house. And so the psychiatric framing of trauma, on one hand, it tells us what's happening, which is a response to trauma, which creates psychiatric symptoms. But also, people think they're going to die every minute. And it's, going to the school, going to a shopping market. So our society is so profoundly traumatized. And I think
And how long has that been going on, in your opinion?
We've had rising rates of gun violence, but for me, I kind of start this moment of our history really after the kind of Columbine, Sandy Hook kinds of shootings, where guns we started a cycle where there were more guns, more fear, more anxiety, more guns, more shootings. We're in kind of this cycle. And so I just want to open this with a question, which is, how do you even think about trauma in a context where we are all in some way traumatized or living in a traumatized context? How do you think about it? Because I can just tell you that the standard psychiatric thing, which is, first you remove the person from the situation. Well, how do you do that right now? And so just the question of what trauma is, I just want to put out there first, is very complicated, and it makes coming to common cause much more difficult because people are at a heightened sensibility, which I think is one of the main things.
So put a laser focus on resentments and that piece of it. Do you have any comments on how this could potentially surface?
Yeah, well,
resentment?
I mean, I've written about resentment and race. That's, people who know my book, Dying of Whiteness, is about racial resentment. But actually, for this conversation, I will tell you that what I think the problem is that people are afraid anyway. And then there's a mass shooting, and it's not like one side is for mass shootings and the other side is against. Nobody wants a mass shooting. Nobody wants to feel unsafe. But when we have the conversations in America about safety, they're so often after mass shootings. And that's when we debate gun control or gun rights or all these kind of things. And everybody just retreats to their side. And so I understand why we have those debates then, but it leads to political polarizing resentment, because after mass shootings are such charged moments, people are afraid. How can I send my kid to school? How can I go to the grocery store? And so in a way, these polarizing moments are the wrong times to be having these conversations, I really believe, if we're not having them at other times and laying the groundwork, because it breeds political resentment. People are afraid of the other side because it's like, oh, you're going to take my gun? I won't be safe if I do this, or your gun is killing my kid, that kind of thing. So it's a really charged moment. And so I really think that these after mass shooting moments breed polarization because they are the times that we're talking about life and death, and not, unfortunately, at the other times.
So it sounds like when we talk about this is important, the sequencing of that and how we talk about it. So Dr. Nicole, if I can turn to you to say a little bit about what is the sequencing from your work and your area of expertise look like? What should we be talking about right after a mass shooting? And what should we be talking about 3 months, 6 months, 9 months after that? And how should we be talking about it?
So piggybacking on Jonathan, I think understanding the context of where the trauma happened and the environment around it. So back to your question on resentment, in our most recent event with the Covenant School, I supported students from the Covenant School, but also across the community. One young man in a community where we have a lot of violence, gun violence here in Nashville, said, Nicole, nobody's come when this happened near my home or at my school. And there was some resentment, like, why are they better? Why did you respond?
Why do people care more
And
about
so
this?
I think we do have to think about how I would respond in that school is a little different than how I would respond, in the school where the incident happened. But specifically, we want to give young people, community members, time to share how they're feeling and what they're thinking, and to ask questions, and also to provide some psychoeducation. So what is normal? It is normal to be scared or anxious, or maybe struggle with your sleep
So
or
validate
feel
those
guilty.
emotions.
Yes, and so we have to start there. And oftentimes in communities and schools, I see administrators want to just get back to the business of normal. And we are scared that if we have these hard conversations, maybe we plant ideas in someone's head that's not there. And the research is very clear. It's important to take the time to debrief and help young people and old alike.
So do we have a time frame based on, sadly, we've had a number of cases now and circumstances that we've learned from. And have we noticed a pattern in terms of?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, in the research, we call right initial, like the day of it happening and the hours and moments after, psychological first aid. So we're
Okay.
making sure that everyone is.
That is psychological
First aid.
First aid. Okay.
Yeah. So you can think of it as if you cut yourself,
Yeah.
you need some first aid, but we minimally need that psychological first aid after a traumatic event. And I think it would be important to note that is after a shooting, that is after a tornado, that could be after a bus crash or a car accident or losing a beloved teacher to cancer or something. So this can cross
I see.
incidents. But in the beginning, we're doing psychological first aid, things that are immediate. And then we usually say the first day back to school. We want to have some debriefing time. In my work, we use the Mitchell and Mitchell model for debriefing and giving that time and space for adults and young people to come together and kind of work through that protocol. And then from there, we want to think about memorials if that's appropriate. We want to think about teaching resiliency and coping skills. We want adults to keep eyes on the young people for those that maybe are struggling longer or more than others that might need additional mental health supports. And I think it's important that we think about dates. So like for us in our community, the first day of school for Covenant as well as schools across this country is coming up. Walking back in that building the first time can be traumatic, can be scary, provoke anxiety. Anniversaries of events, birthdays of ones that were lost.
Right. Well, one of the things we're going to want to get into as well, I think, is talking about and building on Jonathan's point about when is the right time for us to have a societal conversation around this more globally, so that it's not polarizing and it's unifying and in the spirit of unity. But we'll get to that in a second. But I want to talk to Dr. Jara for a moment and ask you, where's the hope?
So the way that I frame hope is I differentiate from positivity and wishful thinking and optimism and even pessimism, and more an understanding of hope as the thing that animates us towards something. And what is that starting point for us in terms of what we're looking for or at? And so for me, the way that I define hope is something that we cultivate, but it's also an understanding that reality is not the exhaustion of all possibilities. And although And that kind of helps us, or at least helps me and my students gauge with the idea of ongoing trauma, ongoing circumstances of being tired, of being resilient, and the ways of at least understanding that other ways are possible, even though that we might not see it in our lifetime, right? And it's a kind of what are we working towards?
I see.
And it sets that kind of frame. Not necessarily I think it holds the complexity of what it means to hope, and also what it means to hope in community, and what it means to hope in spaces where we all have different beliefs and different understandings of how we should engage in political activity or what opinions we should have. And so for me, that just leaves the space of, so what is the place that we want to imagine? And not just in terms of when we start talking about these things, or how can we ask these questions, or what is the right question, but then what are the things that we're cultivating in our daily lives and our daily practices that help us gather that as a resource when these things happen. So it's not to your point in terms of the conversation happens right after mass shooting happens, and then there's nothing to really grasp on or say agarrarse, because then there's nothing necessarily that we've cultivated up to this moment for us to be ready. So I think a lot about preparation. I think play with the idea of hurricane epistemology, because you prepare for it. Right, you prepare for these, and it's also in a way it's a trauma response of knowing that this is coming, so you're ready. And so what are the rituals, for me is what are the rituals and what is the kind of community that you cultivate or who do you engage with that help you then have these resources.
And how do you do it in a way that doesn't re-traumatize? How do you talk about it? How do you discuss it? How do you engage as a community?
To do that?
Yeah.
I guess that sometimes, so for example, I think a lot about rituals and the things that we do that we need to do something to externalize whatever is happening inside of us. And so we set up candles, go to the site and put up prayers and just stand there in silence. And so sometimes silence also holds that space of being in community and feeling in community in the aftermath. Bringing somebody a meal after a tornado.
And how long is the aftermath?
How long is the aftermath?
Yeah, typically.
It depends on, especially, it's just hard to think about aftermath as if this is not something that is continuing to happen.
It's continuing,
right? So and that's the ongoing. That's the ongoing part of the trauma of it's not in my backyard anymore. But it's not that it's not in it. It's already. Part of me, and then now how I operate in my predisposition as soon as I leave my house.
Right. It's something you're constantly fostering, it's something you're constantly engaging
Which
with.
means that you constantly then need to gather these resources and these tools when something is triggering or when something is, there's a new event or just new information that comes to your body when you're engaging in a conversation, or even having a long silent drive and something pops up, or music, all these things that either trigger or help you understand the depth of the trauma.
What's the best thing to do? Because we're wanting our listeners to understand and get some tips on how to deal with these moments and these triggering moments. What have you, and we can open it up now as a conversation here to talk about what are some of the best things to do in those moments if you're listening to a song and it triggers an emotion and you're just suddenly crying. What's the best thing to do in that instance, for example, that you found?
Oh, I'd just say cry. I would just say cry, let it out. If you need to park. And so in terms of tools and the ways that I work with this is those moments, although they happen and they pass, right? You stopped crying. Then the reflection that happens afterwards in terms of and this is what happens in community in terms of holding spaces, right? These might be things that happen isolated, you in your home, or as you're preparing, for the day. And so what are the communal spaces that are being held to just sit and think and process these feelings or these emotions? Or what are the routines that you have in your daily life that will foster these experiences? So I think, again, to the word of ritual, which is something that I do to prepare me towards something that I do to help me transition towards something different than something that's habitual. Habitual would be I wake up in the morning and I make coffee. But the ritual part of it is that I wake up in the morning to a particular song that I play instead of just an alarm that sets me in a particular predisposition to the day. And then making coffee is the time that I pray. As I'm making the coffee, I'm praying.
I see.
And I'm having that centering moment, and I think about the day, not the anxiety of the day, but then I think about the day and what do I want? Who do I want to be today?
Right.
And it's something that just takes up, it's productive, right? Because I'm doing an exercise that I have to do every day.
Yeah.
But that at least for me, like that would be something that I've cultivated into becoming a ritual so I can come back to myself.
Got it. Thank you.
I was just thinking, like, when do we have that space? Like, it's such a conscious decision to even have the space to listen to the song and cry, because in the real world, you hear the song that makes you sad, and before you can process it, you're going to get 75 tweets about some horrible thing happening.
As to where social media comes in,
Yeah.
and how we manage that.
And so it's just that where do we have the room to mourn? How do you even create that room? In a way, I will say, not to counter what I said before, but at least the moments after mass shootings are times where people are focused, even for a moment, on the same thing, and there's a community sense of it. And so the sense of, I just want to clarify what I meant before is we're not going to solve big polarizing issues after mass shootings, but I do think after mass shootings are really important moments because people are focused on the same experience in a community. And it's just, think about how often you don't have that. The pandemic, 1 million people died, and it just kept going, and we didn't have any time to mourn. Climate disaster all the time, shooting all the time. So how do you carve out that space? And it's just like this idea, and I think, Summer, you're exactly right, that the idea of like before an event and after event is so ruptured right now. Maybe that was always the case, and we just know about it more from social media now. But it does feel like the ongoing nature of, you're just in high cortisol all the time. And so where do you even carve out that space is key step number one, I would think.
And I think that, so in that, for me, in that time of crisis, that's where, as an academic and as somebody who has the privilege of having the time of sitting and thinking through these things, that time of crisis is the time that I look at, because that's where the shift happens. And so what is it that we're able to let go of and prioritize this event in order for us to be community? And so it shouldn't always have to be a crisis, right? But in terms of, there's something that happens that you are able to let go of certain things in order to attend the human, the person, the need that's right in front of you. And you don't necessarily, well, some people do, but you don't necessarily ask questions of who do you believe in, what do you believe in, who do you vote for, and then I'll give you the bottle of water. Or then I'll come to you, I'll give you the napkin for you to dry your tears, right? And so that's the moment of crisis where I think that our humanity shows in a particular way that we don't necessarily take advantage of, because it just happens so quickly, and then on to the next thing, and then and then you just, as the individual that you might be, even if you're part of a church community, an organization, then that's not there anymore, and then you go back to what's habitual, right? Instead of the ritual part of it, of a very intentional way of living.
And I think that it's important that we step out a little bit and think about what can we control. I know with my clients after mass shootings or disasters, I felt so out of control in that moment. So what can we control? We can control speaking to our peers kindly, how we respond. We can control how much social media and how much media we watch and intake. We can control if we move our body every night. Well, you can turn your phone off at 9 p.m. every night instead of
sometimes if people are addicted, if it's becoming an addiction.
Well, I think the research would show yes.
Yeah, so how do you break that addiction?
But how do we break the addiction of sugar? How do we, so I think there's some things that we can, in that way of ritual of, if I know I'm addicted to my the tweets and the social media, then maybe I say between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., here's my bedtime ritual, here's my morning coffee ritual, and this is really sacred space to renew my soul, to move my body, and then to go. And I think you asked about the song, what do you do when you cry? I really, as a mental health professional, feel like as adults, we have to lean in and model that for our young people. You got to go through the emotion. It's not dry it up. Why are you crying? It's okay. Let's sit in this for a little while. Let's talk about it.
Well, yes, go ahead.
I was just say also, and hyper-awareness doesn't mean connection.
Right.
And so sometimes even that craving of connection that you continue to find on social media or seek for in social media, you don't end up finding. So when are the times where you actually forget that you have a phone, and it's usually when you're engaging in other activities, when you're present with other people, that you get to have those moments of respite, because otherwise it's just coming from everywhere, and then eventually, the way social media works is that it gets curated towards the things that you were already watching. So you're not going to get anything new information or kind of a different perspective, because you've already created a culture around what you consume.
Right. So how does generational trauma fit into this, too? That's an open question.
I mean, I guess with my experience with generational trauma is that for many of the families I work with, they're a little numb to some of these things going on. So, you know, I'll have teachers or parents say, I thought my child would be really upset by X, and they just seem not to be reacting at all. And so we don't want to re-traumatize. We don't want to make someone feel something they're not, but we also want to be really mindful of how this can play out over generations and what that means in not just their mental health, but their physical health. I mean, we understand that trauma can impact your physical health and your heart disease and dying at an earlier age and obesity and all those things. So I think it's something we have to really look for and to try to help support instead of just saying, okay, they're good, move on to who seems to not be good.
Right. Yeah.
I keep thinking in this conversation about our relationship to trauma also. Like, there's the trauma that we experience either in our own lives through loss, or because our communities are traumatized, or because we live in a society where it's present. But we're also researchers who study trauma. And so a lot of times we're also hearing other people's expressions of trauma and trying to understand them or categorize them, and then maybe intervene. And I feel like as a researcher, I've learned so much about my own assumptions. And one point I want to just add to this is language is really important. The example I always think of when I was writing Dying of Whiteness, I was interviewing people who had lost children to gun suicide in southern Missouri, like about the most traumatizing thing you could possibly imagine. And I would go to these support groups and interview the people, and just remarkable, and just, you know, I'm still in touch with a lot of these people, like really just brave, cool people. And when I first started the interviews, you know, they would have lost children to a gun sitting on the bedside, or you know, something like that. Just as a parent, unimaginable. And when I first started doing the interviews, I would say, did this change how you feel about guns, or something like that? And it was the wrong question. And I didn't.
What was the right question?
They would say, no, guns are part of our life. Like, of course I don't, the gun is my protector, something like that. And so what I realized was I was asking a question from my own ideological perspective, which is basically, not that I meant it anyway, but did this happening make you a Democrat or something like that? It was a loaded question, and they called me on it every single time. And so I actually said what you said, which I would turn and I'd say, what's the right question for somebody like me, an outsider? What do you think what would be the right question? I actually ended up not even asking the question. I'd say, what do you think the right question would be to understand what you're going through right now? I kind of turned the tables in a way. And I learned so much about how people feel about safety, about protection, about
what would
loss.
they say, though, a lot of times? What would the question be?
Yeah, so a lot of times they would say, what do I do to feel safe? How have I changed my daily routines? How do I change my things in my home? But really it was about the sensation of safety. What do I do to feel safe? That was the one that came up probably the most often, which is a different question than, did this change your opinion about a gun, which is a political symbol or something like that.
I see.
You know, we would then talk about, what does it mean to fear for, you know, parenting and childhood. I mean, it became a much more universal thing.
So is gun ownership part in becoming intertwined with identity?
Very much. No, I think that's part of this story was that a gun was coded, and a liberal guy from Nashville coming down and asking people about guns. I became aware of my own positionality, even though I was trying to be empathic. But I learned that I was asking a political question, even if it didn't seem that way to me, but they caught it right away. And so, you know, how did this experience change your life? How did this experience change how you think about the world? Something like that was a much better question. It got back to guns. And what I found was a lot of times people would actually come around to, I wish I had a gun safe, or something like that, like a position that's closer to mine. But if I led with that, immediately, and it's really, it works both ways, but it's so much of our language is triggering. It codes what side you're on, and it makes all these trauma conversations.
And is
super hard.
safety more in that context about physical safety over emotional safety?
Or political safety, yeah.
Or political safety?
I think they all are intertwined. I don't know that I've had conversations where they wouldn't all be mixed in that, you know, if you don't feel physically safe, you're probably not psychologically safe either.
And also just in terms of the way that I've experienced in terms of storytellings and the stories people tell around their ownership or the ways that they see guns is through a story of family and a passing down of, this is the gun that I used with my father to hunt. And so this is the memory that's related and attached to it, right? And so it just becomes, more of a part of not just a national identity, but your own history as a person. And I think a lot about, to your comment on, you know, asking the right question is the same one as holding space and just letting things be generative instead of a very direct question, which is when I did my research around hope and where the hope is, my first question was not, what is your hope or what is hope?
Yeah.
Because then that would just, it would just encapsulate whatever their assumptions were of me saying the word hope. And it would usually be a one-liner that then I would just need to unpack versus, you know, how do you engage in these situations and where does your faith come into play? And then eventually, 2 hours later,
You said, where does faith come into play?
Yes.
So let's talk about that for a moment. Where does faith come into play?
Well, I think that first of all, and that's the first question, because I think in scaffoldings, right? I think in terms of how do we build and construct these worlds that we sometimes, because we're either in the same zip code or in the same room, we make assumptions of saying certain words, and they hit very differently in each of our bodies. And the image that usually I do an exercise with students, and I ask them, draw a house, and they'll draw a different house. And then I say, draw love, and then they just all draw a different thing, right? Because there's different images that come to mind. So the faith component is, you know, what is the being, the thing, the community that you're holding onto, and what is that teaching you in order, or what is that telling you how to act in this moment? And from there, stemming these other ways of adding meaning to your daily life. Not just in terms of, you know, if I can say a slogan, I can say a Bible passage, but that doesn't tell me how people metabolize and really understand and live out what their faith is.
I was going to say, you know, I understand that the purpose of this great conversation is to, you know, lead to some, you know, what can people do? And so hopefully people can hear that what we're doing is we're saying that the lessons of research provide ways to have this conversation, right? And I think one that is also beneath the surface, I mean, the other thing I found in my research is I encounter people all the time. I interview rural conservative people very often. If we met on Twitter, they would hate me, and I would never, you know, whatever, because it's like, you know, 240 characters or less, or whatever social media, like our engagement.
And a lot of times you're testing things on Twitter too, aren't you?
But also our engagement is mediated through a medium that monetizes division, right? That, oh, you're on this side or that side? Oh, how could you ever have it? And then you generalize, like, oh, all liberals are this, or all conservatives are this, or all whatever group is this. And what I find is, like, when I'm doing my research, it's so much more complex to talk to people in person, because people who would like, I'm now really good friends actually with people who we would hate each other if we met each other on Twitter. But then you meet and it's like, oh, we both like the same sports team, or I can see, you know, you might be a creep on Twitter, but you're also a really great dad, and you're actually much less vitriolic in person, or something like that. And so the other lesson I think of research for having these conversations is that social media wants us to take this teeny sample size and then generalize that all people in some group are bad or good or whatever, and it kind of creates a tribalizing narrative.
Otherwise.
And part of why that's hard is because that's how we engage with each other now. We kind of create those communities. But you know, your work obviously fits right into this. But it's just kind of like breaking out of that. Like, how do you talk to people? in a moment of trauma, how do you talk to people who are not ideologically aligned with you? How do you do that? And I think partially that's what we're talking about.
So I want to talk about that breaking out piece. So breaking out of the cycle of trauma. Is it possible? And if so, what does it look like in action?
Well, I guess from my work, I would say that yes, it is possible. And we have lots of amazing examples all over the world of what it can look like. But I think...
Can we give a few of those, or one or two?
Jump in here.
You guys want to be
thinking about
thinking.
the ways that we respond, something that's tangible, that changes, that shows you kind of like the breaking away, the breaking or the evolution of trauma is the shift on how we respond, and the being able, and eventually that becoming culture, but that being able to catch ourselves and say to myself, like, this is a trauma response, or this is something like, you know, the first thing off the bat that comes, and eventually you catch that long enough that it becomes culture.
So awareness.
But also there's research on mass shootings, social science research, that 4 days is the time that people hold that narrative in their head for them. If you're not affected by it directly, there's a 4-day window. There's a 2-day window where people all have the same trauma. Then there's 2 days where then we divide into pro this or anti that. But you have a 4-day window. Mass shootings, it's pretty clear if you're not in the town, that you have 4 days of everybody thinking about the same thing, and then they move on to the next thing. People's capacity to feel empathy
Right.
for something that they're not directly involved in, it's a
Right.
very short window. So I think that's part of the issue is if we're going to have these conversations, these interventions, and it's an open question, is it better to have those conversations in that 4-day window when everybody's focused on the same thing? Or is it better, as I feel, also to build scaffolding that shows people the value of communicating and collaborating beyond that 4-day window? So I think that's kind of one of my big things for people in my work is you can't just do it in 4 days. You also have to build structures that show people the rewards of collaborating with each other beyond those 4-day windows.
So we have a few minutes left, and I'm going to use the technique that you just taught me, which is, what's the question I haven't asked that I should have asked?
I think that would be what's at stake. And that's, you know, when we respond or even engage in these questions, what's at stake. And I actually have a quote here that it helps. I just happen to have it here. So there's this, Mary McClintock Fulkerson uses Walter Lowe's The Wound of Reason. And so she talks about the wound of theology, this question and seeking of caring for that wound. So she says that transformation is inherent in the image of the wound, for it invokes a sense of something wrong, of a fracture in the things that would be joined or whole. The very sense of harm implies an impulse towards remedy, a kind of longing for it to be otherwise. And so that's the what's at stake question for me in terms of the work that I do. Why do I do research? Is what needs to be tended to, and it is not just about the patching and the moving on, the 4 days that it happened and it changed, because that's not necessarily what the wound or the deep harm that trauma does, or all these events that constantly surround us, and we have to prioritize and reprioritize in our lives. But the why and the what's at stake is very important, because I think that that's the thing that grounds you when you are engaging in different issues and also responding towards different issues, which is why, even though I have different political views, what's at stake is your humanity, your personhood. So I'm going to give you my water. I'm going to share my resources because this is what's needed at the time. And there's these other things, although they operate and they have a very tangible impact and consequence in our society, it's not, I can make that separation and prioritize.
I would say, what do we build? In a way, trauma, of course, is very personal, and it needs to be, right? People experience loss in very individual ways, but our way of dealing with it a lot of times, of course, it's individual. Of course, it's about touching effective communities. But I always think, like, what structures should we be building on the other times so that common cause is possible?
Yeah. That was my
Favorite,
sequencing question.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my favorite example of this, I'm going to use a political term, the Affordable Care Act. When we were first debating the Affordable Care Act, it never saw the light of day, but one of the ideas in the first version of the ACA that never came into being is, how can we get communities to collaborate for health? And the idea somebody had was, what if we reward an entire town for certain metrics, building more bike paths, building more parks, fewer ER visits, lower systolic blood pressure, lower blood sugar. If we create these metrics, and what if the whole town does it, everybody gets a tax break. And so the idea was, you're going to force people to collaborate beyond their block. It's not just your neighbor, it's other people. And then if everybody collaborates, then they all get something they want, which is a tax break, which in America is, we all love it. And so I thought it was so smart, because it was kind of like structurally, you weren't saying, let's go hug our neighbor. It wasn't kumbaya. It was like, here's how we're going to build bridges that are going to last and create metrics that are important
and rewarding
rewarding. And so it wasn't about emotion in a certain kind of way.
Did that happen?
That was one of the first things that got cut out. So it happened in some communities, very effective in some communities. In fact, Tara McKay, one of my colleagues, studies this. So it happened in certain communities and it was very effective, but it didn't happen between communities because, of course, the Affordable Care Act, a lot of it got cut out. So, but I still think for me, it's like, how can we create that algorithm?
So is there a disconnect between communities right now?
Oh, absolutely. No,
Right.
absolutely. But the thing is, it's not about just empathy. It's also about how do we build bridges to reward people collaborating with each other in a way that then people can see the tangible rewards. For me, I think that's where,
Because you're not always going to feel like it.
Yeah.
If it depends on you actually, right, like, and when you think about faith and how it comes into play, that this has to come from a very, from a selfless act, it doesn't always, that's not what generates it all the time. Like not even within faith communities, it's a selfless act of you helping your neighbor, because there's a reward of heaven, right? So there's still a way to create like that algorithm or that like that benefit of, it's not just my tax break, but eventually you're going to end up seeing what it does in the community as a whole, and how there's the rippling effect of future generations.
And yeah, so how can we build those structures?
And I think building off of that, I would love to see us say, if it happens to you and it doesn't happen to me, it still is important to me. And then thinking, so if somebody in North Nashville isn't safe at night, what are we all going to do about building those algorithms to think? And then again, I think, maybe our viewers are thinking, that seems really big and out of my control. So what can you do to take care of yourself, to take care of your family? I can watch my own rhetoric. I can watch my own post. I can make sure I'm not being divisive in my actions, and that when I see someone in need, I don't just walk by, that I'm doing something actively to do that, and then modeling that for my students here, for my family, and one person at a time. I hope we get
if we can just get those algorithms to also reward that same behavior that you're talking about, I think we'll be on a better track than the one we're currently on. So with that, I want to thank you all. Thank you for this conversation, very timely and important. And hopefully healing for many who are listening in. And so thank you, Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano. Thank you, Dr. Metzel. Thank you, Dr. Cobb. And thank you, the Project on Unity and American Democracy and Vanderbilt, for hosting this conversation with us today. As many of you know, this project is working to elevate the role of research and evidence-based reasoning into the national conversation, and we hope we did just a little bit of that today. Tune in for more. Please visit our website, stay connected, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.